All right. So welcome everybody to this week's Baha'i.chat. We're really happy to have everybody here. As always, Baha'i.chat is a conversation series dedicated to our interconnectedness. It is an uplifting moment when we can turn our thoughts to spiritual ideas, and we root each weekly session in the Baha'i writings and the fundamental teachings of the Baha'i Faith, which include the oneness of religion, of humanity, and this week we're going to talk about the oneness of God. And the idea of this topic is quite unique to many people, but it exists in every dispensation, and it's part of this core idea in the Baha'i Faith of the oneness of mankind. To think about how physically, as a humanity, spiritually, we are all one, we are all united. Also core to the Baha'i Faith is the idea of independent investigation of the truth, which means that no one's faith should be conditioned on anything other than that individual's search for and understanding of truth. And so through Baha'i.chat, we aim to explore truth at the deepest level, that of spiritual reality. We are so delighted to be joined today by Rob Stockman, who is a scholar specializing in Baha'i studies. He has been called the foremost historian of the Baha'i Faith in America, and he's currently the director of the Wilmette Institute. He received his undergraduate degree from Wesleyan University and a doctorate in religious studies from Harvard University. And we're really delighted to have him with us today to talk about this idea of progressive revelation. Before I turn it over to Rob, I wanted to let everybody know that we are also live streaming this talk on Facebook. So you can head over to the Baha'i.chat Facebook page and share that stream with your friends. And we are also going to end our talk with a little bit of a Q&A session, as we always do. So if you're joining us on Zoom, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can send questions in there. And if you're joining us on Facebook, you can send questions in through the comments. So with that, I want to turn it over to Rob and David, who is our Baha'i Chat executive producer, who will be talking to Rob about progressive revelation.
Thank you so much, Anissa. Welcome, everyone. Glad to have everyone here. Wanted to give a little bit of a background before we introduce Rob. That there have, through the ages, been many souls, the prophets of God, great philosophers and thinkers, who were ahead of their times. They gleaned truths that the majority of the people of their day did not. And those who grasped such truths and were compelled to share them usually got into big trouble. Each of the prophets of God were among those who faced severe persecution for advancing such truths. Tortured, imprisoned, exiled, crucified, shot by a firing squad, their followers fed to the lions, or in more recent times, in the mid-1800s, at the birth of the Baha'i revelation, 20,000 put to death in the most horrible ways in a single decade. The prophets, of course, were not the only ones who got into trouble advancing misunderstood truths. In February 1600, a 16th century Italian philosopher, a former Catholic priest, Giordano Bruno, was tried during the Roman Inquisition for heretical ideas. Bruno believed at that time that the universe is infinite and that other solar systems exist. A fact, of course, we know today to be true, but in 1600, it challenged the worldview taught by the Catholic Church, threatening its primacy. There's another truth that the generality of mankind to this day continues to misunderstand. It's a misunderstanding that really has been the cause of conflict, war, carnage, destruction, the unnecessary loss of millions and millions of lives over the centuries. It's a truth alluded to in the Holy Scriptures of virtually every one of the major world religions, but conveniently ignored, even misconstrued by the respective clergies, and therefore generally lost on their followers. It is the single most misunderstood truth, I think, that is today tearing the modern world apart, threatening our very survival. So if it is true, we should probably figure it out before it's too late. It really is, it's a pretty simple truth. I think when contemplated, it just makes sense. In fact, it makes sense out of all of history, provides a fresh perspective that allows us to see one another as brothers and sisters. It's a truth spoken of by Jesus Christ and found in the Gospel of John, where this is recorded. Jesus said, I have many things to say unto you, but you cannot bear them now. Howbeit, when he who is the Spirit of truth is come, he shall guide you unto all truth. Now, as Baha'is, we refer to this yet largely misunderstood truth as progressive revelation. The idea is simple. It's that all of the various major world religions that seem so fragmented, they're not separate at all. Each one is a chapter in an extraordinary book or plan conceived by the mind of God to carry mankind forward from age to age, providing essentially the same fundamental spiritual teachings, but shared in measures that mankind, the recipient of those teachings, would be capable of understanding at the time. I'd like to just share a quote of Baha'u'llah, if we could bring it up. It's what he has to say about his own revelation relative to those of the past. Baha'u'llah writes, "This is the changeless faith of God, eternal in the past, eternal in the future." Now, I think just as the misunderstanding of this fundamental truth has led to such horrors over the centuries, when the sea change occurs, and we know that it will because that's also promised virtually in all of the world's great scriptures, when the generality of mankind comes to an unequivocal understanding of the truth of progressive revelation, that it's all connected, just as we now understand Bruno's view of the universe to be true, then the condition of the world will be transformed. That's the topic of today's Baha'i.chat conversation, progressive revelation, the truth that unites. Rob, you already got an introduction. Rob is also the founder, by the way, of the Wilmette Institute, a 25-year-old institution providing hundreds of courses on various aspects of the Baha'i Faith and related topics through a wide array of scholars. He has his doctorate from Harvard University in religious studies. Rob, what a pleasure it is to have you with us here today.
Thanks, David. Delighted to be here. It's good to see you again. Haven't actually seen you for a while, and it's nice to be able to visit with you and to talk with you again.
As we're all sheltering in place now.
Exactly.
I know you prepared a few slides and have some sort of general thoughts on progressive revelation. So give us some context for why God has unfolded his plan literally over the centuries.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the basic insight for everybody to think about that is humanity has never stayed put. We are always changing. We're always advancing. We're always developing. And because of that, our understanding of the world is always changing. Our ethical needs change because we suddenly face new challenges. Our spiritual needs change. And so you always have to have some source of guidance, spiritual guidance that's available to humanity as it faces new challenges. 20,000 years ago, if somebody invented a bow and arrow or something like that, all of a sudden they could kill more animals. They might help run out of game in the area. Their kids could feed more. They consider themselves more important. They might start, abusing women more. And so you have a whole new set of sort of challenges because of that invention. And we see that all the way down through history, down to the steamship, down to the telegraph. Suddenly people all around the world could communicate, and some people start taking advantage of other people because of that. So humanity always has had these new ethical challenges and these new spiritual challenges as it discovers new things about itself and about the world around it. And so inevitably had to have additional divine guidance from humanity from that ultimate source, shall we say. And that guidance might come through prayer, it might come through inspiration, but Baha'is also believe that there were these unique individuals, these manifestations, as we call them, who appear every few hundred years somewhere in the world and who bring to humanity, at least that part of humanity, some new guidance, some new insights, spiritual insights, some new ideas about how to behave together, how to live together. And that this, of course, is essential for that progress to continue. So perhaps we could look at a slide which gives a couple of, we'll start with this first quote if you're interested, David. This is a quote from the son of the founder of the Baha'i Faith, Abdul Baha. And that first quote is very, very short. At the top there, the religion of God is one religion, but it must ever be renewed. And this emphasizes the fact that there's only one source, ultimately, of spiritual truth in the universe. That spiritual truth doesn't just favor white people or black people, Australian people, Japanese people. It always is concerned about all the creatures on this world and provides them with some sort of guidance to help them advance, help them understand themselves and the world around them. The second quote on this same slide, also by Abdu'l-Baha, the son of the Baha'i Faith's founder. Wherefore, the dispensations of the past, in other words, the previous periods of religion, when someone brought a message, the dispensations of the past ages are intimately connected with those that follow them. Indeed, they are one and the same, but as the world groweth, so doth the light, so doth the downpour of heavenly grace. So here we have a quote that tells us that whenever there is a new message from God, it's always intimately connected with that previous message. And because of that intimate connection, it really builds on it, but it's able to do more. That quote says the downpour of heavenly grace grows, you see, so it becomes even greater. So those are two quotes from the writings, the sacred writings of the Baha'i Faith. Shall we see a third one, or do you want to say something about these, David?
No, I think keep going. This is
Okay.
great.
Well, there we have a longer quote. This other one here. The treatment ordered by wise physicians of the past. So here the prophets of God and the other sources of guidance are compared to doctors, right? The treatment ordered by wise physicians of the past and by those that follow after later doctors is not one and the same. Rather, doth it depend on what aileth the patient. So humanity's illnesses vary from age to age as we grow, as we have teething pains when we're young and we have other kinds of pains later. And although the remedy may change, the aim is always to bring the patient back to health. So the religions have always aimed to help us as a human species and as individuals to be more spiritually healthy, more just to each other, more kind to each other, more enlightened in our behavior towards each other. All the religions have sought to do that in their own way, in their own time and place. Then the quote goes on, this is also by Abdu'l-Baha, the son of the founder of the faith. In the dispensations gone before, the previous religions, the feeble body of the world could not withstand a rigorous and powerful cure. For this reason did Christ say, I have yet many things to say to you. And of course, you had given the rest of that quote also, David. A very powerful quote to indicate that always the need for new guidance, new revelation, new insights for us. So perhaps if you're curious, we can take a quick look at the different religions and get some idea of the problem even from a historical point of view, if people see that. So that would be another slide.
As you're bringing those up, let me just mention that there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, sort of in the center, and we will be taking, after the initial interview, we'll be taking some questions for Rob, so don't hesitate to start writing your questions in the chat.
Yeah, this just is a very quick listing of various prophetic figures. Baha'is regard all of them as what we call manifestations of God, individuals who brought guidance from the divine, from the ultimate mystery, whatever you want to call it, that looks over us, guards us, and protects us and guides us. And you will see that, for example, with Abraham, the date of his birth is uncertain by 300 or so years. With Moses, only 100 years, because it's later, closer in time to us. With Zoroaster, because there was no literacy, over 1,000 years. We don't know whether he lived in 1700 BC or 600 BC. It's a huge problem. With the Buddha, he could have been born as early as 560. He could have died as late as 400 BC. We're really not even sure of that, but that's a smaller range. Usually as you get closer and closer to the present, the range.
I think we have a little bit of a technical challenge here. Still making our way through technology we're just becoming familiar with. So I think we may have even lost Rob. Anissa, can you confirm if you're seeing what I'm seeing?
Yeah, I also have Rob as stuck and muted on my screen.
Okay. Well,
Oh, and he just left. So
okay.
I guess we'll wait a minute for him to
Yes,
to
I'm
come
sure
back.
that he'll be returning. So I had a question I was going to put to him, and maybe we could talk a little bit about it as we're waiting. And the question was, well, first of all, he had a couple of other interesting slides, but let's wait for him to return for that. That if Baha'is believe that all the major world religions are valid, why are there so many religions and so much conflict and confusion? In fact, why don't you bring up the slide? I think, I don't know if it was the next one or two or three in. Oh, there, we have him back. You're on mute, Rob. Just need to unmute yourself. There you go.
Now. Sorry, we checked my internet speed earlier today, and it was great. But of course, the way it works is that you can have great internet speed until you have no internet at all.
Yes. Welcome to the world of technology.
So anyway, the whole point of that chart was to show you that as you get closer in time, you have a better idea of when these people actually lived. And if you look at how long it took for their teachings to be written down, you can see with Moses, it's like, with Abraham, it's almost 1,000 years. With Moses, it's like 300 years. With the Buddha, it's a couple of hundred years. With Jesus, it's only 30 to 50 years. With Muhammad, it's pretty much in his lifetime. And of course, with the Bab and Baha'u'llah, it's written down literally by them or dictated by them to their secretaries. So obviously, as you get closer in time, it's just so much easier to know what these people actually said, how they were guiding people. And that gave them more ability to give people the guidance that they needed. And so that's a very important sort of historical thing to remember about the world's religions.
I think also you have a slide I thought was very interesting. Of course, we know that Baha'u'llah is the first prophet of God in history to have written in his own pen.
Right.
You were showing that in the past, the prophets came and it took 200 and 300 years before people began to recognize and before the traditions, actually the verbal traditions, were translated. But I think you've got a slide that illustrates sort of just the volume of teachings of each of the prophets. I think that's the final one.
It's the next one, I think. Yeah. So this gives you a sense of, for example, the quantity of text that exists today. In the Old Testament, 623,000 words. I think that's the English translation. There are different numbers, by the way. But of course, how much of that is actually from Moses or Abraham is itself a tiny fraction. Some of it is history and some of it's other stuff. With the New Testament, 185,000 words or so in English. If you were to look at a red letter edition of a Bible, you'd mostly find the words of Jesus in the Gospels, and they're much smaller than that, obviously. And a friend of mine who does historical Jesus stuff boils Jesus down to about 5 pages, believe it or not. It's kind of amazing. Then with the Quran, you got about 77,000 words, and all of that supposedly is straight from the mouth of Muhammad. Ultimately, they say from God, of course. But look at what we have with the Baha'i Faith, with the Bab, Baha'u'llah's forerunner. 2 works, he wrote some really long stuff, 5 million words that we have today in our archives. With Baha'u'llah, the founder of the faith, 18,000 works, 6 million words. Abdul-Baha, Baha'u'llah's son, his successor, 5 million words. Shoghi Effendi, the final successor in that whole series, 5 more million words. So I often like to tell people that we don't have a Baha'i-ble, we have a scripture website. And of course, we have maybe 5% of this translated into English so far because they wrote in Arabic and Persian. So a huge amount of stuff. And then the Universal House of Justice, the current body that's the head of the faith, which is authorized to give official, authoritative interpretation of the Baha'i teachings. Not interpretation, but elucidation, clarification of the teachings. Their staff and they have turned out who knows how many hundreds of thousands of letters in the last, well, now it's been how long? 60 years since they were founded. And of course, they're reelected every 5 years. So we now have an elected governing body that will continue to give us guidance forever, you might say. So it's a fascinating comparison, what you can do today compared to what you could have done in the past.
You know, it's interesting, Rob. I'm thinking about sort of just the volume you were showing in that graph, a writing of the Bab, who is, of course, the forerunner of Baha'u'llah. We have two prophets of God, twin prophets born 2 years apart, both in Iran in the middle of the 1800s and 19th century. But I always found it fascinating. The Bab wrote that if the teachings of all past religion that had been given by all the prophets of God we know about, you named them, equaled 2 letters of the Arabic alphabet, which the Arabic alphabet has 27 letters, not 26, that the one whom God would make manifest, he's referring to Baha'u'llah, would single-handedly reveal the other 25. And you just in terms of, I think that graphic really illustrates that.
I mean, it's so much, it's easier for a zillion reasons. I mean, at the time of Jesus, maybe 10 or 20% of the men who lived in cities could read and write. People in the countryside couldn't read and write at all. Almost no women could read and write. So it was really hard to transmit information by writing. You had to have priests. You had to have bishops and monks to keep track of this information, to read it and be able to pass it on to other people. The reason Buddhism was able to grow and survive is because the Buddha himself invented the idea of the monk and the idea of the monastery. And it was the Buddhist monasteries that spread around India and brought the Buddhist teachings to that whole area. And then, of course, spread it all the way up to India, from India to China and Japan and Korea and all that. You had to have monks. People couldn't read. Nowadays, people can read. You can now translate this stuff, and you can now disseminate it. And you can, if nothing else, put it in a Zoom talk like this. And so we're in a totally different situation. So the needs of the world are different. The ability of people to learn it themselves is just different.
You know, that's making me think, as we've talked about, that, you know, at the most fundamental level, the core teachings, or the spiritual teachings, if you will, of the major world religions are essentially the same, though the way they're put out, the volume, if you will, the depth of how they're explained does vary. Like the golden rule. I mean, you find the golden rule in all the world religions. And again, essentially the same, but there's another set of teachings, which are the social teachings, which I think you were kind of alluding to in terms of, once we needed clergy, maybe we don't need them anymore. So what's the difference between, maybe give an example of a spiritual law versus a social law, and what are some of the social laws that are different today that Baha'u'llah brings?
Sure. Well, I think the very fact that people can now learn to read and write, you know, in the past, it would have been really impossible to marshal the resources to do universal literacy. And even if you could, what would they read? There were no printing presses. Everything had to be hand copied. So it was even the Greco-Roman society at the time of Jesus was largely an illiterate society with an elite who could read and write. So today, everyone can read and write. So Baha'u'llah says everyone should learn how to read and write. Now, there's an example right there of a social teaching that would have been impossible. And that included, of course, from the point of view of Baha'u'llah, women. And he also said that women should be able to pursue a vocation just like men. So this, again, is really, when you think about it, a shocking change. He lived in Iran and in the Middle East from 1817 to 1892, where women generally didn't work unless they were absolutely poor and had nobody to take care of them. But Baha'u'llah said now the world has changed. Women should have the right to read and write. They should have the right to work, and that they and their future spouse should decide whether they're going to marry or not. They can't have the arranged marriages that were so common in the past either. So these are just some examples of the huge changes that are now possible. Again, technology makes these things possible. And because of the technology, the ethical teachings can be different than they were in the past. They have to be different. Before, you couldn't have made everybody equal because everybody would be half starving. In the past, they forced some people practically to starve to death so other people could live comfortably or in luxury, which was not right. but there wasn't the surplus we have today. So the world has, because the world changes, you have to have new teachings.
Now
I think I told a story. I think I told you that story.
Oh yes, share it.
Let me tell you the story. You know, about 140 years ago, 30 years ago, 1880s, 1870s, I don't remember exactly, a Protestant minister wrote a book called In His Steps. And in that book, he said, he wrote this as a novel. He said, let's imagine this little town in Wisconsin where everybody in the town makes a pledge that before they do anything, first they'd ask themselves, what would Jesus do? And so the novel's all about people asking themselves that question. And of course, they help drunks stop being drunks, and they stop selling liquor in their stores and advertising liquor in their newspapers and all that. But it's a 100% white town. You know, there's no conception in the book, oh my goodness, we have to deal with racism. That idea is not even there. And the fact is, if people ask themselves the question, what would Jesus do? There's 20,000 different Christian sects with 20,000 sort of different answers. And so it's not at all clear that you can just ask yourself a question like that and be a good person and solve the world's problems. You need new social teachings to guide people, new ethics, basically.
I think that you make a really good point here that, you know, in former faith movements, we've seen the division, you know, as you mentioned, the case of Christianity, and they've all been divided, but in the case of Christianity, literally thousands of sects. And the Baha'i Faith, we have scriptural promise that this is the day not followed by darkness, that though there are those who might try and make an attempt, but the faith would never be divided. It would be one unified movement across the planet. So what's the primary reason that religions of the past have been divided? Why is it that the Baha'i Faith won't be divided? It hasn't been yet, but why is it that it won't be in the future? And does it even matter?
Yeah, well, you know, first problem you have is writing down the teachings. And as we've seen, that was a big problem in the past. So you can't necessarily even capture exactly in detail what the guidance was. And then you have to have people to interpret and explain it to people. And there was in the past no effort to appoint a clear successor or to create an institution that would guide everybody in that faith and decide what the correct understanding of that faith was. When you don't have that, you have the situation where a lot of people, all of whom think they're smart, and all of whom think they're right, because, you know, when people are smart, they often think they're right. So all these people who are smart and all these people who think they are right start to argue. They start to disagree. And so you get differing interpretations. And from those differing interpretations, you get different sects, different movements. And inevitably that causes a problem. I love this, the statement, First American Baha'i, Thornton Chase, once commented that what happens to religion is it gets filtered through the brains of men. And this is exactly the problem. Hey, we do our best to try and understand it, but we don't always do it very well. And so you need an institution ultimately, kind of like the US Supreme Court, to say yay or nay, you know, this is the way to go. And that's what the Baha'i Faith has. And in addition to having that institution, it also has the promise that the institution is rightly guided so that it will always keep us going in the right direction. And with that, we have confidence in it, and we have a way of resolving differences when our own very smart people who disagree have some place to go to resolve their disagreements.
We've got some questions flowing in, and again, keep them coming. In just a few minutes, we're going to go to the Q&A. You know, Jesus Christ, and really in maybe different terminology, I think all the prophets of God have in the past spoken about ultimately in the future that the kingdom of God would be built on earth.
Right.
You know, how does the Baha'i Faith relate to that prophecy?
Well, you know, that kind of thing would have been utterly impossible in the past when people couldn't see each other, they couldn't meet each other, they couldn't travel, they couldn't communicate. They didn't even know what was going on the other side of the mountain or the other side of the world. Today, with our communications and with our transportation, with our global network, our global market, we're in a situation where everyone in the world needs to know what's going on, and we have global problems. Sea level is going to go up maybe 6 feet in this century. It's going to flood a lot of places along the shoreline, including certain people's very prominent mansions in Palm Beach, for that matter. So these are the kinds of problems that humanity has to deal with today. So we have to have this common framework. And Baha'is believe that Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i Faith, is that messenger of God who will bring us the teachings that we need to build that kingdom of God on earth. The old joke is people would say, how do we get the kingdom of God? And the answer is that the blueprints fall from heaven, not the kingdom. The city of God doesn't descend on a cloud. The blueprints to build the city of God descends, perhaps, shall we say, in the form of these books. Then we have to figure out how to do it. We have to do it ourselves.
So let me ask you as well that, there are many folks, and it's a reasonable question, would say, look, if there are many religions, we revere all of the religions, whatever religion we choose should be fine, which is true, it is. But talk a little bit about the mechanics of the administration of the Baha'i Faith, this extraordinary program that Baha'u'llah set in motion. And while he defined it, in effect, even today, it exists in the world. We don't really know, as we know in the writings, we don't really know what it will evolve to and look to,
right.
Look like at some point in the future. But talk about, how, it's not just enough, I don't think, any longer to follow the teachings of love. And you were talking a little bit about that before. Right. What is it about the administrative order that is so unique and extraordinary?
Sure. Well, as we mentioned already, or we perhaps suggested, the Baha'i Faith has no clergy, no ministers, no priests, no nuns, nothing like that. And we live in an era, for the last 500 years, where people could learn how to vote. And so the whole idea in the Baha'i Faith now is that people can vote to decide who their leaders should be. But of course, as we know, in the voting systems that exist in the world around us, people can be manipulated. Someone will say, they'll say, vote for me because I'll give you this. And they make all kinds of promises. And then they turn around and say, and don't vote for this guy over here because he will kill you. He will destroy you. He'll take things away from you. He's a commie. He's a whatever, So just being able to vote isn't necessarily going to solve the problem. The Baha'i writings, Baha'u'llah, Abdul-Baha, and Shoghi Effendi, the final successor, they made it clear that when we vote, we do not mention any names. We do not campaign. We have no nominations. Everybody prays and votes privately. Husbands and wives don't even talk about who they're going to vote for. And the idea is to vote for people who have the best qualities, the best character, the best spiritual qualities. What they might want to do is irrelevant. And so that's how it works at the local level. And then you have delegates from the local level who get together to choose the national level of organization. And then that's annually. Then every 5 years, all those national governing bodies get together and elect the Universal House of Justice, the worldwide governing body. And so you have a system which attempts to focus on the qualities of the people who should be elected, not what they're going to do, what they stand for as persons, as what their character is. And that, of course, plus experience is important too. And those things produce a very different kind of governing system, very different kind.
I think, Rob, it's also interesting that I think for the first time in religious history, not only did Baha'u'llah make clear the succession of authority, which protects against the division, people not, people being confused about where to turn and people putting claims forth and one claim here and one claim there. But also Baha'u'llah established the Universal House of Justice and conferred upon them, as I understand it, infallibility. So not the individual members, but as an institution. And, it's amazing to watch in the Baha'i world how how in lockstep the Baha'is are. It doesn't mean we can't think for ourselves or have opinions and so forth, but ultimately when the Universal House of Justice gives its guidance, it's so lovingly received. There's no, and the other thing is that, you know, when a decision is made at whatever level by an institution, whether local, national, or the House of Justice, whether it's by unanimous vote or by majority, we don't have a dissenting opinion. So, you know, it's not a matter of reporting which members don't like it, and
Right.
then everybody has a record. You can't. So, you know, talk a little bit about just that
Right.
that extraordinary.
Well, I think it is indeed an extraordinary thing that the only thing that is promised is that 5 members out of 9 will vote right. There's no promise that any particular individual is special or perfect or unusual. We certainly hope that they have some good qualities, and all the members of the House of Justice I've met, and I've met a fair number of them, I suppose. I was one time in Haifa for an entire month doing research, and I was able to meet several members and have dinner with them and that sort of thing. And they were all very inquisitive individuals, open-minded, very honest in their opinions, very encouraging. It really was quite an amazing experience, frankly, to meet them. But none of them were obviously infallible. So we always work hard to agree on things. We discuss things to the point where we can have a consensus. We don't have to do Robert's Rules of Order. We ideally have everybody on the same page on things. But if there's a disagreement and you don't feel like you can wait until the group has agreed on what to do, the principle of unity then kicks in. If a majority feels that a Baha'i community should try something, and some people disagree, the people who disagree, it's their duty to let that opportunity, that idea have a chance. Because if most people feel an idea X is good and 3 people feel it's bad, it might have been a good idea, but if those 3 people argue against it enough, it might fail because of them, not because it was the wrong idea. So we have to give those ideas a chance so that we all learn together. And then if we find the idea wasn't so good, we all change our minds.
So let's go to a few of these questions here. I've got one that's kind of a triple-parted question.
Good.
The first part, I think you'll tackle. I'm not sure that the other 2 parts are not hearsay. You will probably know much better than I would. But so could you explain the view within Islam that Muhammad was the last prophet? And then it goes on to read, I've also heard that if a new prophet came, they must be subordinate to Muhammad, can't exceed him in excellence. They also say the new subordinate prophet can't alter his teaching or bring any new law or religion. So the first part of that, again, is explain why folks feel that Muhammad will be the last prophet.
Well, there are various statements in the Quran. There is a statement in the Quran about Muhammad being the seal of the prophets. And it also goes on to talk about how he's the father of none of you, and that's so it's a long quotation which happens to mention that he's the seal of the prophets. Now the whole question is, what does the seal mean? You put a seal on a letter when you're done with a letter, and that indicates that the letter is finished and ready to be mailed to people. It also indicates that it's true, right? You put a seal on something, and it's the badge of authenticity. So there are different ways of interpreting that particular passage, and Muslims throughout the history have not insisted that that particular text means that Muhammad is the last prophet. That is one interpretation amongst Muslims. And in fact, probably a lot of the reason for that particular interpretation has to do with the rest of that question. And that's that if other people come along as pretenders and claim to be a messenger of God, they're going to split the religion of Islam. And so it's the easiest thing to do is to say, nope, there's nobody. So that has a lot to do with that.
They split it anyway.
Yeah, it gets rid of them, basically.
You have to split it, right?
Yeah, it gets rid of them. Now, this whole other question about whether the other prophets have to be subordinate to Muhammad may refer to the idea of the mujaddid, the innovator, that every century there'd be a new innovator within Islam. And ideas, I don't think, uniformly understood. Now, I'm not an Islamicist. I'm not an expert on Islam, so I'm not sure if I can give a good detailed answer for these questions, but that's what I understand anyway about the topic. What else do you have?
Oh, so let's just take a look here. Well, here's one. With your slide on the manifestations, maybe it was just a typo, you were moving quickly or whatever. You had a question mark on Krishna's existence. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, you know, with Krishna, there is so much legendary material that determining exactly who he was and when he lived is extremely difficult. Everybody is familiar with the text in the Bhagavad Gita where he talks about himself. He opens his mouth and Arjuna looks in and he sees the stars and he realizes that Krishna is this avatar of the god Vishnu. So you have this really amazing scene where he's basically declaring himself a manifestation of Vishnu, or of, in that case, shall we say, of God. So you have that, but you know, there's a whole other side, erotic literature side of Krishna, where he supposedly is fathered 100,000 sons, and he seduces goat milkmaids out in the fields and this kind of stuff. So there's this incredible range of literature on Krishna, some of which is more, shall we say, more secular, but even that can be fairly religious stuff too. And trying to wade through all that stuff and figure out who he was, when he lived, what he taught, at this point is pretty much impossible. It was a pre-literate society, and the stories that built up around him they're fascinating. They're a lot of fun to study, but you really can't quite figure out what to make of them sometimes.
Well, here's an interesting question. A Baha'i scholar, Mirza Abulfaz, writes that the prophets have two types of teachings: the type that is attributed to God, spoken by God through the prophets, of course, which constitute the revelation. The second type is that contain matters such as historical matters as to how creation happened, the history of lives, the lives of the prophets. Do the Baha'i writings include the second type, and how are the two types separated in Baha'i and in the past?
That's a really interesting question. Baha'u'llah does, shall we say, quote sources occasionally in his texts. So certainly he does refer to historical materials sometimes. He quotes poets a lot, actually. To what extent, where that is Baha'u'llah and where it's God, for example, I don't know if anyone can really say. If the revelation of God in the mind of God doesn't have Arabic or English or Persian words to it, it then has to come down here to a human being's brain and being converted into words. And that process is a human process as well as a divine process. So we look at different messengers of God and they write in different styles, for example. And so I think that there's a mix, and I don't know if there's an easy way to answer that question.
You know, maybe along that line, you could talk a little bit about the fact that not only with the coming of Baha'u'llah is a new revelation, a new dispensation inaugurated, but a new cycle of dispensations that we have been through: the prophetic cycle, the cycle, the Adamic cycle, we also refer to it. And I think so it's replete with history and promises of the future. In fact, at the end of the prayer that Christians say, that my understanding is the phrase Amen means so shall it be. We don't say that anymore because we believe we're actually living in the day of the fulfillment, a new cycle. And Baha'u'llah ushers in this extraordinary cycle that will last, we're told, no less than 500,000 years, though there'll be prophets of God along the way. So perhaps, and I'm just wondering, perhaps the history and, and such is not as much an issue. I know that in some of Baha'u'llah's writings, he, without saying he's even doing it, he refers to scripture, whether it's Quranic or Christian. Christian is interesting because he had no upbringing in that. That in effect, he's explaining what the abstruse allusions even mean. So maybe talk a little bit about the new cycle that we're in.
Well, I think you maybe asked two different questions there. So I'll have to let me see if I can go back to what I thought was the first question.
That's the fewest questions I usually ask. Sorry.
That's good. I mean, you mentioned the idea of being in a new cycle, and this is a very important idea in the Baha'i sacred texts. We live in a very different world now. The rate of change, the rate of innovation has accelerated immensely. People discover in 1 month as many new things as people probably discovered in 1,000 years, 10,000 years ago. mean, the rate at which we learn as a human species has accelerated immensely. And because of that, we need a whole new scale of revelation. Like I said, Baha'u'llah and such, we've got 6 million words from Baha'u'llah. We have a scripture database instead of a Bible, instead of one book. And so we had to have that because of the situation the world is in today. Baha'u'llah himself says that this is a new cycle from Adam through Muhammad was one cycle. Let's call it the cycle produced by the agricultural revolution. But now we're in a cycle of the information revolution, of the industrial revolution. And so we needed the Bab and Baha'u'llah, 2 messengers of God in the 19th century with all of their guidance, to be able to handle all that change for just the next 1,000 years. And then we'll need more messengers of God too. Baha'u'llah is not the last one.
I'm being told by my co-producer, Anissa, that I should ask a couple of questions I hadn't seen that are actually coming in from Facebook, since those folks may not, be staying on as long. So here's one. Does the Baha'i Faith consider all manifestations equal in their spiritual authority?
That's an interesting question. Yes and no, you could say. Baha'u'llah says that some messengers of God, some manifestations of God were, shall we say, able to be more widely influenced than others. So, for example, Jesus, with 1/3 of humanity following him, has had an absolutely enormous impact. So certainly from that point of view, there's a really huge impact from some messengers and less from others. Certainly we regard all the messengers of God as equally divine, equally a source of guidance to humanity at that time and place. But obviously, if you had a messenger of God 5,000 years ago and he could only speak a language that was in a particular valley with 1,000 people, and the other valleys, people couldn't even understand that language, how much impact could he have? He's limited by the cultural limitations of the time. So that's, I would say, is the answer.
Yeah, and what we're saying is, and I think the writings are very clear, that while the message may vary due to the exigencies of the times, the prophets of God, the divine manifestations that have established the major world religions are one and the same in the spirit. To prefer one above the other is blasphemy, we're told in the Baha'i writings. So their limitations are imposed by God, not because they're limited. They have innate and spontaneous knowledge. They know everything that ever has been. And this is why Jesus said, I have many things I could say, but you're not ready for them. Right. And that is, that I think puts it into perspective as well. So here is a question. Is there a particular book that people like this questioner can study to get acquainted with Baha'i in first contact? Let me just say one thing about this. I don't know if that person is still here. I hope they are, or for anybody else that's here. We have a program called Baha'i Guide. All you have to do is send an email to info@baha'i.chat, and in the subject line, write guide. And the purpose of that is to connect you with an individual in any manner you want, or it's done virtually, but in any mode that you want, that can answer some questions and understand where you're coming from to lead you to a book or an approach. That there's so many different doors. It's this vast ocean. So please do write to us and let us know that that you're interested in such a service.
I can recommend a few things too.
Yes,
if you're interested. I mean, anyone who wants basic information, go to Baha'i.org. BAHAI.org. And it's a really nice, quick, easy to read website, which is our international website. You can click through and read it in Swahili if you want. For that matter, I think it's available in like a dozen languages. Or Baha'i.us, which is obviously the US equivalent. If you're interested in reading Baha'i scripture, it has a lot to do with what type of scripture you want to read. Something like the hidden words, which are short little quotations of about 3 sentences each, which are sort of mystical and ethical aphorisms, are very attractive. That's a nice place to start. There's a book called Gleanings from the Writings of Baha'u'llah, which is about 250 pages long, and it's got a lot of half-page, 1-page, 2-page little extracts from his writings, which is very good. Abdu'l-Baha's Some Answered Questions is a nice one. But there's so many choices. It has a lot to do with what really you want to learn, I think.
There's also a wonderful app that you can get on any cell phone called Baha'i Prayers. It's got a star in the center of it, which has not only prayers, but writings as well. Here's an interesting question. And that is, this person is saying they see a lot of people on social media afraid of globalization. How do we as Baha'is respond to that concern?
Well, you know, anything humanity does that's big can be used for good or for evil. This is true of science, money, and sex, to give 3 examples. And that's also true of globalization. So bringing the world together as a single market, which is basically the economic side of globalization, has a lot of advantages. But as we can see with the coronavirus outbreak, it has certain disadvantages too. You can spread a virus very quickly to the entire planet. Baha'is see globalization as a potential tool for the advancement of humanity. And by globalization here, I just simply mean the fact that we can travel, we can learn each other's languages, we can go visit each other, we can gradually learn to live together. If we don't learn to live together, we're going to melt the ice caps and sea level is going to go up and the air is going to get polluted and the temperature is going to go up and we're going to have a lot of problems. We have to figure out how to live together on this little world of ours. And so in that sense, globalization is a huge opportunity. It's a challenge and an opportunity.
So here's a question. What are satisfying explanations to questions about each manifestation being the last or the only way, the final prophet?
Sure. Well, you know, it's a natural thing for followers to assume that their guy's the greatest, you know? Of course, that's a natural assumption. And there are always a certain number of, shall we say, fairly exclusivistic kind of statements you'll find in scriptures too. And perhaps the best example of that is in John, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one cometh to the Father but by me. Baha'is understand that in various ways. Certainly Jesus would not have said, well, you can't follow my return. When I return, ignore him. That's not obviously what that passage means. And we believe that Baha'u'llah fulfills that prophecy of the return of the Spirit of Christ. We believe that Muhammad was too. And so we don't believe that exclusive statements like that are meant to stop people from investigating the next messengers, the next prophets of God. It's meant to remind people how incredibly important that particular messenger was at that time and in that place, because they were the way, the truth, and the life at that time. They were the door, and that's why they were so important at that time.
And doesn't Baha'u'llah effectively say that they and he are one in the spirit? They're different individuals, different personalities, but their function, which is to illumine mankind at any given age, is essentially the same. I'm thinking of the, please.
They're the same spirit. They're the same spirit. And that's the spirit in the sort of general sense, I suppose you could say. And that's very important.
Of the commentary in the Tablet of Ahmad where Baha'u'llah says, no, verily, he who has turned away from this beauty hath also turned away from the past and showeth pride toward God from all eternity to all eternity. And I think that's applicable, obviously, not just to him, but to each of the prophets. To not revere one is really, in one other connection, he calls it blasphemy to not revere one of any of the prophets of God.
I note Baha'u'llah doesn't say go to hell either.
But he doesn't mince any words, does he?
I mean, it's not a good idea. But we don't believe in hell, you know. It's not like it's going to cause someone eternal punishment or something. It's just not recommended. It's not the best
Rob,
thing to do.
It's always a pleasure to have you, and it's always a lot of fun as well.